Concerns are rising in Australia about the potential impact of a trade war with the United States on medicine prices and availability. The incoming tariffs on Australian pharmaceuticals heading to the US could threaten both the affordability and access to vital medications here in Australia. As US drug companies now push for higher prices, the Australian government remains committed to its pharmaceutical benefits scheme, which ensures lower costs for consumers. Current negotiations and discussions are ongoing. The situation creates uncertainty, though, for both manufacturers and also for patients. For more, let's bring in Professor Tim Harcourt from the UTS in Sydney, also host of The Airport Economist here on Ticker. Great to see you.
Yeah, good morning, Aaron. Good to be with you.
So we've been obviously watching and worried about tariffs on steel and aluminium. Now we're talking about medication. What's going on?
This has been a long-running issue between Australia and the United States, Aaron. Even when we first initiated the Australia-USA Free Trade Agreement under the Howard government, it took a lot of lobbying, in fact, intervention from the then opposition leader, Mark Latham, to have the PBS, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, carved out from the negotiations. So that was quite a big deal, and the Howard government had to sort of respond to the opposition because they know that the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, the PBS, like Medicare, is very popular in Australia amongst the electorate.
What's the worst possible situation for Australia here?
Oh, the worst possible situation is that I guess big pharma, big American drug companies put pressure on the Australian government with respect to the PBS, and Australian consumers, patients lose, a very good access to a very good scheme, and also potentially, even if the scheme remains in place, there's going to be ramifications for the international drug market.
It's really interesting because we're seeing at the moment that the Canadians are preparing to head off to an election, the snap election, which has been announced by Mark Carney. And since Trump has set his sights on Canada, the Liberal parties, as in what used to be Justin Trudeau's party, now Mark Carney, they're doing better in the polls, in fact, edging ahead of the Conservatives. When something like the PBS comes under threat in Australia by Trump's tariffs, does that drive people to or away from the government of the time?
Probably helps the government. I mean, Mark Carney's been able to wrap himself in the maple leaf and do ads with Mike Myers and several other Canadian celebrities quite effectively. But it's interesting that you raise Canada in this context, Aaron, because of course when Canada and the United States had their free trade negotiations, the Americans didn't like the public medical system of the Canadian provinces for the very reasons that it thought it made American healthcare and American pharmaceutical companies unfairly uncompetitive. And, the answer to that is, why don't you have a public, socialist medicine in America, of course, was the Canadians' response. But it shows how things like, old-fashioned tariffs on agriculture and manufacturing, when it comes to services and complicated issues like healthcare, tariffs and trade policy suddenly gets into other realms of public policy like healthcare. And we saw that as a big warning for Australians when the US were trying to do it to Canada when they had their own free trade negotiations back when Brian Mulroney was the Conservative Prime Minister of Canada.
Yeah. Well, the budget week promises positive news for Australians grappling with cost of living pressures. Households can expect $150 rebates on their electricity bills as part of the latest federal budget update. While inflation has significantly decreased since late 2022, the Reserve Bank anticipates a slight rise in consumer price index later this year after the end of the current electricity subsidies. The federal budget projected to show a smaller deficit than previously expected, thanks in part to unexpected population growth and commodity prices. But could handouts now lead to higher inflation? Professor Tim Harcourt, your thoughts?
Well, again, the fight on inflation continues. Maybe the battle's been won for the short term, but we don't know about the war. We don't know about the impact of Trump's trade policies on the price of imports and therefore inflation around the world, and that's obviously a concern for Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve. What's interesting in the budget is that the budget bottom line's been pretty good because we export a lot of commodities around the world. And we've also relied on immigration and the return of international students with very high population. But at the same time, that's put pressure on housing, which has been obviously a political issue in the forthcoming election. And also some of the implications of net zero is it means it's shaken up energy prices, and then the government's turning around and saying, well, we're going to give you relief on energy, where ironically they're in a sense asking us to pay for their policies of net zero whilst sort of compensating us whilst they sort of turn their back on Australia's comparative advantage.
It doesn't make much sense, does it? It's a weird one. The other thing that is hard to wrap your head around is obviously the federal budget showing a smaller deficit thanks to population growth. But as you say, that same population growth has led to real people experiencing a rise in rents. And that is something that a lot of Labor voters will be quite frustrated about.
I think that's happening. I think it's partly intergenerational too, with people unable to get into the housing market, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne. Some of the blame's been put on international students quite unfairly, but that, whether it's fair or not, that becomes an electorally sensitive issue. And in some ways, the big I guess challenge for something like net zero is, as you move away from coal and iron ore, natural gas, they're the actual export commodities that is making your budget bottom line look pretty good. So if you move away from that, not only are you going to get energy costs rising, it means that you'll have to pay, I guess, energy cost relief because of those policies, and also you've got a worse budget bottom line in which to pay those subsidies to consumers.
Well, the opposition's point is that it's kind of like stealing from you, as in raising taxes to then gaslight you by giving you back electricity subsidies to pay for those things because inflation has gone up and the government spending and tax rises. Let's not forget every levy you pay has gone up in price over the past few years as well. So are they essentially double dipping but telling you that they're trying to fix things?
Well, that's part of the story, and that's it's the need for relief because of the changes in energy policy. The other issue is to what extent is providing short-term household relief going to fix structural problems? I think people are happy to take the money, but if they still see housing shortages and energy pressure, they're not always that satisfied. So it's a question to which the relief they provide to households is enough to retain their vote in a tight election, or whether people will see it as a handout and vote accordingly because they're worried about long-term structural problems.
Well, Taiwan has voiced its disappointment after members of the Trans-Pacific Pact, the Trade Pact, failed to form a working group to consider its membership. Despite Costa Rica being invited to discuss its entry at a Vancouver meeting, Taiwan received no similar consideration. The Taiwanese government urges the CPTPP members to act swiftly and without political bias regarding their application. Taiwan continues to fight for its place in international trade amidst pressure from China, which claims sovereignty over the island. I know you've spent some time in Taiwan. What do they want?
Yeah, you're right, Aaron. In fact, we will be launching the Airport Economist Taiwan special episode shortly on Ticker, and we're having a launch in Sydney, in New South Wales Parliament House. Look, Taiwan has been an excellent global citizen, whether it be as a member of the WTO, as a member of APEC in the region, or indeed, as we saw during the COVID pandemic, they would make a very good member of the WHO, because when you look at fighting pandemics, Taiwan is well ahead of the curve and has excellent health and public policy dealing with SARS and COVID and so on. Now, in terms of trade, they hold 90% of semiconductors. They're a huge exporter in semiconductors and IT around the world, and they're at the head of the game in terms of AI. They have huge investments in the US and India and Southeast Asia, huge investments from Japan and South Korea. And indeed, despite political tensions, Taiwan invests a lot in the People's Republic of China as well, and there are business ties across the strait. So if you look at economic terms, and that's what the TPP is about, it's about economic integration and economic prosperity, then on the grounds of prosperity, Taiwan would make an excellent member of the TPP. And in terms of health, it'd make an excellent member of the WHO, just as it's been an excellent global citizen if you look at APEC or the WTO. So economic grounds, prosperity, you'd say that Taiwan would be a first-class candidate.
The issue is no one wants to anger China, obviously, and that is something that many of these organisations would have to grapple with or avoid losing China there as well. Now, in terms of the reason Taiwan is looking to economic policy and economic cooperation, are they learning from what happened in Ukraine, where it's been very much military over economic, but the way out of the Ukraine war seems to be economic certainty as opposed to military certainty, because the other side, vis-a-vis Russia or China, just won't put up with military?
Yeah, well, there's nothing in any diplomatic agreement or any pronouncement that governments have made. There's nothing stopping a country like Australia or Canada or the US or indeed the EU as a grouping having trade and investment ties with Taiwan, whatever people's position is on China and Taiwan. So Taiwan sees its best suit, because it's ahead of the game in terms of semiconductors, in terms of AI, in terms of innovation, to strengthen and cement its economic links right around the world and around the region. So it's in the best position possible. Now, militarily, it's a very different kettle of fish from Ukraine. An invasion would have to happen on water, and we know how they often turn out not very well. So economics is the name of the game, and that's why Taiwan wants to join the TPP.
Professor Tim Harcourt there in Sydney from UTS and host of the Airport Economist channel right here on Ticker. Appreciate your time as always. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks for having me.
This week, the focus shifts to the Fed Reserve's preferred inflation gauge as markets now continue to grapple with uncertainty over President Trump's tariff proposals. The S&P 500 edged up by 0.5%, while the Dow climbed over 1% despite those lingering market concerns. Investors now anticipating key economic indicators, including consumer confidence and fourth quarter growth estimates, alongside quarterly results from companies like Dollar Tree and Lululemon. Fed Reserve Chair Jerome Powell acknowledging that tariffs are creating added uncertainty, but suggests any inflation rise in 2025 may be temporary, as the markets now await clearer signals, many economists advising investors to concentrate on the fundamentals of their holdings.